The hall was a cathedral of sound, or at least that's what the people who paid a lot of money to sit in it liked to say. Sunlight, thick and golden as honey, poured through the high windows and fell across the polished wood of the concert grand piano. It was quiet now, but a busy, nervous kind of quiet. The air hummed with whispers, the rustle of expensive programs, and the soft thuds of doors closing as the last few people found their seats. On the stage, in a row of stiff velvet chairs, sat the new students. This was the first master class of the year, a brutal and beautiful tradition where they would play for the master, and he would tear them apart to build them back up. Or so the theory went. All eyes, however, were on the man himself, who sat apart in a larger, throne-like chair. Professor Alistair Finch was not a large man, but he filled the space. His silver hair was swept back from a sharp, intelligent face. His suit was dark and perfectly fitted. He held a pen, not tapping it, just holding it, as if it were a conductor's baton waiting for the chaos to begin. He surveyed the line of young men and women, his gaze as calculating as a jeweler assessing uncut stones. He saw the usual things, the trembling hands of the boy from the countryside, the arrogant tilt of the chin from the girl who had won every competition back home, the eager, desperate shine in the eyes of them all. They wanted his approval more than anything in the world. His eyes moved to the end of the row and stopped. There she sat. She was different. Not older in years, perhaps, but older in spirit. While the others seemed to vibrate with anxious energy, she was still. Her hands, resting in her lap, were not the soft, unmarked hands of a lifetime spent in practice rooms. If you looked closely, you could see a faint, pale line across one knuckle and a small callus on the thumb that didn't come from piano keys. Her clothes were simple, a plain dark dress that was neat but not new. Her hair was pulled back in a way that was practical, not elegant. Finch's assistant had muttered her name when handing him the list. Elara Vance. No major competition wins. No famous teachers. Her application file had been sparse, but a single, old letter of recommendation from a name he didn't recognize had been enough to get her an audition. He remembered that audition. She had played a piece by Chopin. It had been technically correct, even good, but it had lacked fire. It lacked the brilliant, showy precision he demanded. It had been, in his private judgment, safe. Dull. The master class began. One by one, the students were called to the piano. Their pieces soared and stumbled through the hall. Complex concertos, furious sonatas, delicate etudes. Finch listened like a surgeon listens for a heartbeat. He would let them play a minute, two, then raise his pen. Stop, he would say, and his voice, cool and clear, would cut through the music like a blade. He would then dissect them. Your tempo is erratic. You are chasing the notes, not leading them. Or, that phrasing is sentimental. It's cloying. Music is architecture, not weeping. His critiques were sharp, precise, and often cruel. The students would blush, or nod vigorously, or sometimes their eyes would well up. The audience watched, captivated by the spectacle of it all. Finally, the assistant called the last name. Elara Vance. She stood. Her movement was quiet, unhurried. She walked to the piano, her steps making no sound on the thick stage carpet. She gave a small, polite bow not to the audience, but to the instrument itself, as if thanking it. Then she sat. She adjusted the bench, took a deep, slow breath, and placed her hands over the keys. The hall waited. She began Rachmaninoff. A prelude, one of the difficult, stormy ones. The opening notes were bold, a declaration. But almost immediately, something went wrong. Her left hand, during a rapid, descending run, fumbled. The notes blurred into a clatter, a discordant splash of sound where there should have been a cascade. She recovered, pushing on, but the mistake hung in the air, a stain on the performance. A moment later, in a passage requiring powerful, crashing chords, her timing was off by a fraction. The rhythm stuttered. From his throne, Professor Finch let out a sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft, quick exhale through the nose. A sniff. But in the silent, attentive hall, it was as clear as a shout. It was a sound of pure, unvarnished contempt. The corners of his mouth turned down ever so slightly. Alara finished. The final chord faded. There was a smattering of polite, awkward applause from the audience, more out of pity than appreciation. She kept her head down for a second, then looked up, not at the crowd, but directly at Professor Finch. He let the uncomfortable silence stretch. He stood, smoothing his suit jacket. He walked toward the piano, his shoes clicking on the stage. He stopped a few feet from her, looking down. "Music," he began. His voice, now projected to fill every corner of the room, is the highest form of communication. It is a language of the sublime. But a language requires vocabulary, grammar, structure. He paused, letting his words sink in. He gestured vaguely toward the piano. What we just heard was not a conversation. It was a mumble. Technique, Miss Vance, is the alphabet of this language. The scales, the arpeggios, the finger independence, these are our letters. Without perfect command of the alphabet, you cannot form a word. You certainly cannot write poetry. He looked out at the other students, including them in his lesson. You may have passion. You may have feeling. He said the word like it was something slightly dirty. But without flawless technique, that feeling is trapped inside you. It is noise. It is meaningless. He turned his icy blue eyes back to her. It seems, Miss Vance, that you are still, painfully, learning your alphabet. A few reactions rippled through the hall. A couple of the other students, the ones who had already been criticized, felt a mean little spike of relief. They weren't the worst one. The arrogant girl hid a smile behind her hand. A patron in the front row, a wealthy donor who fancied himself an expert, gave a knowing nod, agreeing with the master. Alara did not cry. She did not argue. She did not hang her head in shame. She simply listened, her face a calm, unreadable mask. Her eyes, a quiet shade of gray-green, watched him with an intensity that was unsettling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt. It was more like observation, as if he were the one being studied. When he was finished, he expected stammered apologies or a vow to work harder. He expected the usual script. Alara did none of that. She gave another small, slow nod. Then she turned to the piano. With great care, she reached out and gently lowered the fallboard, the heavy lid that covers the keys. It closed with a soft, solid thump. The sound was final. It was not the slamming of a lid in anger. It was more like closing a book someone else had been reading incorrectly. She stood up, walked back to her chair at the end of the row, and sat down. She folded her scarred hands back in her lap and looked straight ahead, waiting for whatever was to come next. Professor Finch was left standing by the silent, closed piano. His grand speech suddenly felt hollow, his victory empty. He had thrown his sharpest words at her, and she had absorbed them without a sound, without a flinch. She had simply closed the piano. The interview for her was over. He cleared his throat, announced a short recess, and walked stiffly off the stage, the echo of that soft thump following him. The hall, once a cathedral of expected genius, now just felt like a room where something had been missed, and everyone but the professor seemed to sense it. The days after the master class settled into a new, uncomfortable rhythm at the conservatory. For most students, it was a whirlwind of practice, lectures, and the constant, anxious hope of catching Professor Finch's eye for the right reasons. For the woman at the end of the row, Ilara Vance, it was different. She became a ghost in the halls. She wasn't shunned exactly, but a space seemed to form around her. The other students, navigating their own fears of the professor's sharp tongue, found it easier to avoid the one he had so publicly labeled as lacking. Talking to her might be contagious. They would pass her with quick, polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes, or look away as she walked by with her simple bag of sheet music. The arrogant girl from the master class, the one who hid her smile, now led a small group who would fall silent when Ilara entered the common room, their whispers starting up again, only after she left. Ilara didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, she didn't care. She attended the required lectures, sitting in the back, taking notes in a small, neat script. But her real work happened when the grand practice rooms were empty and the echoing corridors were lit only by the dim, late-night safety lights. Professor Finch was a creature of habit. He often worked in his office until long after midnight, preferring the silence. His office was on the second floor, overlooking the courtyard that housed the oldest practice wing. For a week, his late-night concentration was broken by a strange, repetitive sound drifting up from the ground floor. It wasn't music. It was a single note. Over and over again. It was always the same pitch, middle C, but struck with a maddening inconsistency. Sometimes it was loud and firm. A moment later, it was so soft it was almost a breath. Then it would ring with a bright, piercing quality. Next, it would sound deep and muted, as if played under a blanket. The pattern seemed random, pointless. It was the antithesis of everything he taught: control, progression, melody, technique. On the seventh night, his patience, never thick to begin with, snapped. The note echoed up again, this time with a strange singing quality that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. He slammed his book shut, marched out of his office, and descended the wide marble staircase. His footsteps were sharp, angry clicks in the sleeping building. He followed the sound to a small, plain practice room at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open without knocking. There she was. Ilara. She was bathed in the harsh, white light of a single fluorescent bulb. Her back was straight, her focus absolute. She raised her right hand, index finger poised, and struck the key. The note filled the small room. She let it fade completely into silence, listening with her whole body. Then she did it again. And again. She wasn't using the fancy concert grand, but an older, more worn studio piano. Yet the note sounded different every time. Enough, Finch said, his voice cold and loud in the confined space. Ilara's finger froze in the air. She turned her head slowly. She didn't look startled or guilty. She looked like someone pulled from a deep meditation. This, Finch said, gesturing at the piano with a sweep of his hand, is not practice. This is indulgence. A waste of this institution's resources and your own time. A single note is not music. It is idleness. It is the refusal to do the hard, real work. Ilara lowered her hand to her lap. She looked at him, her gray-green eyes calm in the unflattering light. A single note, she said, her voice quiet but clear, can hold an entire world. If you know how to listen. If you know how to make it speak. Finch let out a short, humorless laugh. Romantic nonsense. Music is architecture. It is a journey. A story. A single brick is not a cathedral. A single word is not a novel. You are avoiding the discipline required to build. My teacher, Ilara said, her gaze not wavering, believed the cathedral lives inside the brick. The story lives inside the word. You have to understand the soul of the single thing before you can build anything true. The way she said, my teacher, caught his ear. There was a weight to it, a capital T. Not just any instructor. Finch leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He was a historian of performance as much as a performer. He knew the lineages, the great pedagogical trees. He was curious, in spite of himself. "And who was this philosopher-teacher of yours?" he asked, a dismissive edge still in his tone. "Who filled your head with these pretty, impractical ideas?" Alara was silent for a long moment. She looked at the worn keys of the old piano, then back at him. When she spoke, it was barely more than a whisper, but the name dropped into the room like a stone into a still pond. Maestro Valery Kozlov. Professor Finch did not move, but the change in him was instant and total. The superior, irritated expression melted from his face. His arms uncrossed slowly. All the color seemed to drain from his skin, leaving him pale under the harsh light. Valery Kozlov. The name was a legend, a ghost, a holy grail. He was the pianist from the last century who had played fewer than 50 public concerts, but whose rare recordings were studied, like sacred texts by people like Finch. His technique was said to be superhuman. But it was his sound, the famous Kozlov tone, that was the stuff of myth. Critics wrote that he could make a single note weep or laugh, could imply a whole harmony within one sustained pitch. He had vanished from public life decades ago, retreating to a remote part of Europe. He never taught, or so it was believed. Finch's mind raced. The sparse file. The old formal letter of recommendation with an illegible signature. The lack of competition history. It wasn't that she hadn't been taught. She had been taught in a secret, direct line from a master who considered the competition circuit to be vulgar noise. "You." Finch's voice was dry, a croak. He cleared his throat. "You studied with Kozlov? For how long?" "From the age of 10 until he died, 2 years ago," Ilara said softly. "I lived in his house. I cooked for him. I listened. For the first 3 years, he only let me play single notes. Like this." Finch felt the world tilt. The foundation of his own expertise, built on decades of analyzing the greats, felt suddenly shaky. He had written a thesis on the inferred techniques of Kozlov. He had tried for years to decode the magic of that sound from crackly recordings. And here, in this dingy practice room, was someone who had heard it in the room. Someone who had been shaped by it from childhood, got all his criticisms of her, the lack of showy technique, the safe choices, the fumbled runs now, looked utterly foolish. He hadn't been listening to a lack of skill. He had been listening to a different language entirely. A language where the meaning was inside the vibration, not just in the sequence of notes. He looked at her hands, the faint scars. Not from manual labor, he now understood, but perhaps from the woodshed near Kozlov's home, from chopping firewood for the stove. He looked at her calm, patient face. This wasn't a student. This was a keeper of a flame he thought had gone out. The arrogance he had worn like a cloak now felt like a cheap costume. The mocking snort he had given in the hall echoed in his memory, a shameful, tinny sound. He had nothing to say. No critique, no grand pronouncement. The professor was gone, replaced by a mere man, humbled and stunned. Alara watched him process it. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, profound sadness, as if she was sorry to have to show him how small his world was. She turned back to the piano. She raised her finger once more and struck the middle C. This time, Finch heard it. Not just a note, but a universe of possibility within it. A warmth, a core, a promise of something immense. It was the ghost of Kozlov, echoing in this quiet, late-night room. He didn't wait for the sound to fade. He turned and walked out, his footsteps now silent on the corridor floor. He climbed the stairs back to his office, but he didn't go in. He stood at the window, looking down at the light from her practice room door, listening to the single searching note repeat into the night, each one a quiet rebuke to everything he thought he knew. The weeks that followed were strange and quiet. The conservatory, a place usually buzzing with dramatic energy and competitive whispers, seemed to hold its breath. Professor Finch moved through his days like a man in a dream. His critiques in class became shorter, less biting. He would often pause in the middle of a sentence, his gaze drifting to the window, lost in thought. The students noticed. They didn't understand it, but they felt the shift. The air of absolute certainty that had always surrounded him was gone, replaced by something more fragile. He saw Ilara in his lectures. She still sat in the back. She still took her notes. But now, when his eyes met hers, he was the one who looked away first. The memory of that night in the practice room, of the name Kozlov hanging between them, was a constant hum in his mind. He found himself listening differently. When other students played, he heard only the surface, the notes, the technique, the ambition. It all sounded loud and empty to him now. He was waiting for a depth he couldn't describe. He tried to approach her once, after a class on Baroque ornamentation. The other students filed out, chattering. She was slower, gathering her things. "Your training," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "With Maestro Kozlov. His approach to touch." Ilara looked up. There was no malice in her face, but no invitation either. "It was about listening," she said simply. "Not just with the ears." Then she shouldered her bag and left him standing there, his question unfinished. She became more of a ghost than ever, but now she was a ghost that haunted him specifically. He would hear the single, searching note from the old practice room late at night, and instead of irritation, he felt a pull. He would stop on the stairs, listening, trying to hear what she heard. He never went down again. Rumors, of course, began to swirl. The other students couldn't explain the change in Finch, so they created stories. The most popular one was that Ilara was a rich eccentric, a donor's daughter, and Finch was being polite to keep the money flowing. The arrogant girl, whose name was Livia, scoffed at this. "He feels sorry for her," she told her circle. "It's pity. He's too much of a gentleman to crush her completely after that disaster." The end-of-term gala was the biggest event of the conservatory year. It was not a competition, but in every way that mattered, it was. The hall would be packed with the city's cultural elite, wealthy patrons, agents from prestigious orchestras, and critics from important papers. A good performance could launch a career. A great one could define it. The program was carefully curated. Only the top students from each master class were invited to perform. Professor Finch, as a senior faculty member, was to give the closing address. His speech was already written, a polished piece about the enduring importance of technical mastery and artistic tradition. He had delivered variations of it for years. Now, the words on the page felt like someone else's, written in a language he no longer fully spoke. The night arrived. The great hall was transformed. Crystal chandeliers blazed. Women in gowns and men in tuxedos filled the velvet seats, their perfumes and murmured conversations creating a rich, expectant hum. Backstage was a chaos of nervous energy students in concert black tuning instruments, whispering scales, their eyes wide with fear and excitement. Finch stood in the wings, watching. He saw Livia, flawless and sharp as a diamond, performing a fiendishly difficult Prokofiev sonata. Her fingers were like pistons, accurate and powerful. The audience applauded loudly, impressed. He saw the boy from the countryside play a sweet, sincere piece by Schubert. It was lovely, if a bit safe. More applause. Each performance was excellent. Technically flawless, emotionally clear, professionally presented. They were everything he had trained them to be. But as he listened, he felt nothing. It was like watching beautiful, intricate machines function perfectly. There was no mystery. No single moment made the air in the room change. The final student bowed, the applause rose and fell, and the stage manager gave Finch a nod. It was time for his speech. He adjusted his tie, walked to the center of the stage, and stood behind the polished lectern. The spotlight was warm and blinding. He looked out at the sea of expectant, well-dressed faces. He opened his mouth, began to speak his prepared words. "For centuries," he intoned, "the rigor of technique has been the bedrock upon which true musical expression is built." The sentences flowed out, smooth and practiced. He spoke of discipline, of history, of the sacred duty of the musician. He was on autopilot, his body performing while his mind was elsewhere, in a dingy practice room, listening to a single note dot as he reached his conclusion, thanking the patrons and congratulating the students. He saw a movement from the side of the stage. A door meant for stagehands had opened slightly. A figure stood there, backlit by the work light from the corridor dot. It was Elara dot. She was not in concert black. She wore the same simple, dark dress she had worn to the first masterclass. She held no sheet music. She just stood, waiting, her posture calm and impossible to ignore. Finch stumbled over his last sentence. A few people in the front row noticed his eyes flicker toward the wing. He finished abruptly, with a stiff "thank you." The audience applauded politely. The event, officially, was over. People began to gather their wraps, to lean over and whisper to their neighbors about dinner plans. Then, Elara walked onto the stage. A murmur of confusion rippled through the hall. People paused, half out of their seats. Who was this? Was this some odd staging error? The stage manager, off in the wings, made a frantic cutting motion across his throat, but Elara didn't see him, or didn't care. Professor Finch stood frozen by the lectern. Every instinct told him to stride forward, to take her arm, to guide her off, to protect the sanctity of the event, the program, the order of things. But his feet were rooted to the spot. The look on her face was not one of rebellion or theatricality. It was one of profound focus, as if she were entirely alone. He remembered that look from the practice room. He could not move. Elara walked to the magnificent concert grand piano, its lid raised like a great black wing. She did not acknowledge the audience. She did not bow. She simply sat on the bench. She placed her hands in her lap, fingers loosely curled, and closed her eyes. The murmuring grew louder. This was bizarre, unprofessional. A few people gave awkward, uncomfortable laughs. Livia, sitting in the front row with the other performers, felt a hot rush of embarrassment for the conservatory. This was a humiliation. She turned to the patron next to her, an older gentleman who had earlier complimented her technique. She leaned in and whispered, her voice a little too loud, carrying in the now quieting hall. "She's forgotten how to start," Livia said, a mocking smile touching her lips. "Or maybe she's praying for a miracle." A few people around her heard it. A stifled giggle came from somewhere. The tension in the room twisted into something else: anticipation for a car crash, for a joke, for an end to this awkwardness. Professor Finch heard the whisper. He saw the smirks. His old self, the one from the first masterclass, wanted to agree, wanted to be part of that knowing crowd. But his new self, the one haunted by a single note, could only watch Elara. She was breathing slowly, deeply. She seemed to be gathering herself, drawing in the silence, the confusion, the mockery from the hall. She was turning it into fuel. Then, her eyes opened. They were not looking at the keys. They were looking at something far away, or perhaps at something very, very close. She raised her right hand, not with a flourish, but with a slow, deliberate grace, as if lifting something precious and fragile. The audience held its breath, waiting for the crash of a chord, the run of an arpeggio. A single finger hovered over middle C dot, and then it fell. The note dot, it was middle C, the most basic note on the piano. The one every child learns first. The one used to tune orchestras. But this was not that note. This was something else entirely. Alara's finger pressed the key. The sound that came out did not just start. It bloomed. It began as a clear, pure point of sound, and then opened, like a flower unfolding in fast motion, to fill every corner of the vast hall. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. It was simply, completely present. The air in the room changed. The expectant whispers, the rustling silks, the last few stifled giggles, they were swallowed whole. The note didn't silence them. It simply made them irrelevant. It was a sound you felt in your chest before you fully heard it with your ears. A deep, warm vibration that settled in the bones. For the patron who had chuckled, a retired ship captain, the note was the low, comforting hum of a great ocean liner's engine at midnight. Steady and powerful, promising safe passage across dark waters. He stopped smiling. His eyes lost their bored look and grew distant, seeing a horizon he hadn't thought of in years. For a young mother in the third row, tired from a long day, the note was the first coherent sound her newborn daughter had made. Not a cry, but a soft, questioning coo. A sound of pure, fragile life. Without thinking, her hand went to her heart. For the arrogant student, Livia, who had just spoken the mocking words. The note was the key of her grandparents' old house, the one she visited as a small child. It was the sound of the heavy front door locking behind her, a sound of safety and belonging she had forgotten. The superior smile melted from her face, leaving behind something soft and young and surprised. The note held. A piano string, once struck, naturally fades. But this note seemed to defy physics. It didn't get louder, but its resonance grew. It was as if Alara was not just playing the piano, but playing the room itself, the wood of the floor, the plaster of the walls, the very air molecules between them. The single pitch began to reveal hidden layers. Within it, attentive listeners could hear whispers of other notes, a ghostly, perfect harmony, implied but not played. It was a chord contained within a single tone. Professor Finch, still standing by the lectern, felt his breath stop. His academic mind, which knew everything about harmonics and string vibration and acoustics, short-circuited. This was the thing he had read about in faded, poetic reviews. The thing he had tried in vain to parse from old, scratchy recordings. The Kozlov tone. It was not a myth. It was here, in his hall, from the student he had dismissed as knowing nothing. He heard more than just sound. He heard the countless hours in a remote house with an old master. He heard the patience of a child striking a note for 3 years. He heard the truth in her quiet statement. You have to understand the soul of the single thing. In this one, perfect note, he heard the soul of music itself, not as a complex language to be mastered, but as a fundamental force, like light or gravity, that could be channeled if one was still enough, pure enough to listen. The note began, ever so slightly, to fade, but the experience of it did not. It had imprinted itself on the silence that followed. The hall was not just quiet. It was a different kind of space. The people in it were not just an audience. They were individuals, each pulled into a private, vivid memory by a sound that had acted as a key. Alara kept her finger on the key until the last physical vibration died. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand. She placed it back in her lap. She did not look out at the stunned faces. She did not seek applause or approval. She had said what she came to say. She stood up. She turned from the piano. She began to walk calmly toward the same side stage door from which she had entered. Her movement broke the spell, but slowly, like waking from a deep dream. No one clapped immediately. Clapping felt wrong, like shouting in a cathedral. People looked at each other, their eyes wide, checking to see if others had felt it too. The shared confusion was gone, replaced by a shared awe that was too big for words. Livia, in the front row, found her cheeks were wet. She didn't remember starting to cry. The old patron next to her was staring at his own gnarled hands, resting on his cane as if seeing them for the first time. Professor Finch watched Ilara walk away. He saw the straight line of her back, the quiet purpose in her step. She was leaving the stage, but she was also leaving his world, the world of rankings and techniques and cutting remarks. She had walked into the heart of his kingdom, and, with one finger, had shown him it was made of paper dot. As she reached the edge of the stage, she passed close to him. For a second, she paused. She didn't turn her head fully, but her eyes met his. In that glance, there was no victory. No, I told you so. There was something sad and something like forgiveness. It was the look you might give someone who has just realized, too late, that he has spent his entire life describing the beauty of a tree by only ever looking at the bark. Then she was gone, the door swinging shut softly behind her. The silence held for another 3 heartbeats. Then the applause began. It started from the back, from a young stagehand who had been watching from the shadows, his arms full of cable. He let the cable fall and brought his rough hands together, a slow, solid clap. It spread. It was not the wild, cheering applause for a dazzling performance. It was deeper, more reverent. It was the sound of people coming back to themselves after a journey. Acknowledging the guide. It grew thunderous, a wave of sound filling the hall where the single note had lived just moments before. People rose to their feet. They were applauding the empty bench, the closed piano lid, the space where she had been. Finch stood in the torrent of sound, unmoving. He was the only person not clapping. He felt hollowed out and filled up all at once. The speech he had given, all the speeches of his life, were ashes in his mouth. She had played one note, one simple, profound, impossible note. And in doing so, she had not just performed a piece. She had delivered the most devastating and beautiful masterclass he would ever witness. He looked out at the standing, applauding audience, at his students with their shocked, tear-streaked faces. The performance was over. But for every single person in the hall, the music, the real, questioning, soul-shaking music had just begun. And he, Professor Alistair Finch, for the first time in his adult life, had absolutely nothing to say. The applause was a storm that wouldn't end. It crashed against the stage, wave after wave. People stood, not because it was the polite thing to do, but because they couldn't remain seated. The sound was for her, but she was already gone. So they applauded the piano, the air, the memory of the note that still seemed to vibrate deep in their chests. Professor Finch finally moved. It was a stiff, mechanical turn. He walked off the stage, away from the blinding lights and the roaring sound. The backstage area was a world of shadows and dangling ropes, a sharp contrast to the glittering hall. The stage manager was there, his face pale, a headset hanging loose around his neck. He looked at Finch, his mouth opening and closing, no words coming out. What could anyone say? The script for the evening had been torn up and set on fire. Finch walked past him, through the heavy fire door, and into the empty, concrete-lined corridor that led to the practice rooms and offices. The roar of the applause became a muffled, distant thing, like hearing the ocean from inside a cave. Here, it was quiet. The only sound was the click of his own shoes and the frantic beating of his own heart. He didn't go to his office. He walked straight to the old practice wing. He pushed open the door to the small room where he had found her that night. The overhead light was off, but the security light from the courtyard outside cast a blue-gray gloom over everything. The old studio piano sat there, silent, a closed book. He sat on the bench she had used. It was still adjusted for her height, slightly lower than he preferred. He opened the fall board. The keys were yellowed with age, the middle C key slightly more worn than the others. He placed his right index finger on it, the way he had seen her do it 100 times in his mind's eye. He pressed down. The note sounded. It was a fine note, clear, in tune. It was the correct pitch. And that was all it was. It was just a note. It held no worlds. It implied no harmonies. It sparked no memories. It was a piece of data, a musical atom, empty of meaning. The difference between what he had just produced and what she had produced in the hall was the difference between reading the word ocean on a page and being knocked over by a reel. Cold, salty wave. He pulled his hand back as if the key had burned him. The hollow feeling inside him grew. He had spent a lifetime building a cathedral of knowledge, and in one evening she had shown him it was built on a foundation of sand. He was a scholar of the map, and she was an explorer of the territory. He knew every tree in the forest by its Latin name, but he had never felt the silence between them. Out in the hall, the applause had finally died. The murmur of the crowd leaving was a low, confused hum. Soon, the students would be flooding back here, buzzing with the shock of it. He couldn't face them. He stood and left the practice room, taking the back stairs to avoid everyone. The next morning, the conservatory was a different place. The usual sounds were there, scales, sonatas, the chatter between classes. But underneath it all was a new current, a palpable sense of dislocation. The students didn't know how to act. The person they had all quietly agreed to pity or ignore had performed the miracle. It messed up the entire social order. Livia, the arrogant student, came to her morning lesson with Professor Finch with red-rimmed eyes. She placed her hands on the keys to begin her piece, then stopped. She looked at her own fingers, then up at him. How? Was all she asked. Her voice was small, stripped of its usual confidence. How is that even possible? Finch looked at her. The old hymn would have given a technical answer about harmonics, about overtone series, about the physics of sound. The new hymn just shook his head slowly. I don't know, he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said to a student in decades. It's not in the fingers. It's in the listening. He canceled his other master classes that week. The administration, having heard the wild stories from wealthy patrons who called it the most profound artistic experience of their lives, did not argue. Alara did not return. Her dorm room was found empty, neatly cleaned out. The only thing left was a single sheet of paper on the bare desk. It was not a note. It was a simple, hand-drawn staff with a single whole note on it. Middle C, nothing else. She was gone as completely as she had arrived. She had not come for a degree, or a career, or to prove a point. She had come to deliver a message, a last testament from her teacher, passed on to the place that needed to hear it most. And having delivered it, she moved on. For Professor Finch, the days turned into a strange, quiet season of repair. He still taught, but he taught differently. He talked less. He listened more. When a student played, he would often stop them not at the flubbed run, but at a single beautifully voiced chord. There, he would say. Right there. What did you feel when you played that? What were you listening for? The students were confused at first. They were braced for scalpels, and he was handing them candles. He began his own practice again, but not with the old, frantic ambition. He would sit at the piano and play a single scale, not for speed, but for the quality of each tone. He was trying to learn an alphabet he now knew he had never truly understood. He never spoke of her publicly. When people asked, which they did often at first, he would just say, she was a remarkable listener. That was all. To say more would have been to try and cage the note in words, and he had learned his lesson. The legacy of that night was not a story of triumph or defeat. It wasn't about the student who beat the teacher. It was about a door being opened that no one had known was closed. Livia stopped playing the flashy, difficult pieces for a while. She started working on simple, slow melodies. The boy from the countryside found a new courage and began to compose his own music, fragile and sweet. The atmosphere in the practice rooms changed. You could still hear the furious drilling of difficult passages, but now, more often, you would also hear long, thoughtful silences, followed by a single chord, struck and then truly listened to, until it faded away. Professor Finch kept that drawing of the single note. He framed it and hung it on the wall of his office, opposite his degrees and awards. It was his reminder. A reminder that before the symphony, there is the note. Before the technique, there is the truth. Before the judgment, there is the sound. Years later, at another gala, a much older Finch would watch a young pianist perform. They were brilliant, flawless, and the audience loved them. Afterward, a donor would turn to Finch and say, "Magnificent technique, Professor. You must be so proud." Just like the old days, Finch would watch the young pianist take their bow, a bright, satisfied smile on their face. He would think of a different smile, one that was never seen, and a single note that had held a hall in the palm of its hand. He would look at the donor, and a faint, sad smile would touch his own lips. "No," he would say quietly, almost to himself. Not like the old days at all. And in the silence after his words, if you listened very closely, you could almost hear it, the ghost of a note, pure and deep, still echoing, still teaching, long after the player had left the stage.